On November 14, 2014, 18-year-old Justin Patton went hiking in the Ozark Mountains and disappeared without a trace during a sudden snowstorm. For 7 years, he was presumed dead until in February of 2022, a man who called himself Justin appeared on his father's doorstep. Instead of joy, however, his father felt icy fear. He was convinced that a dangerous impostor had entered their home. You will find out who really returned from the mountain wasteland and what terrible truth was hidden during these years in this video. Enjoy the movie. Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene. On November 14, 2014, at 9 o'clock in the morning, the gravel lot at the trailhead of the Centerpoint Trail, which leads deep into the Ozark Mountains, was cold and unusually quiet. Closed the door of his car for the last time. The boy, who grew up in the sterile conditions of a gated community under surveillance cameras, perceived this hike as his first step towards real independence. According to witnesses, Justin looked overly equipped. He was wearing an expensive jacket of a well-known brand, and behind him was a brand-new hiking backpack, the cost of which exceeded the equipment of all other members of the group combined. The group consisted of 5 people who met at one of the forums for hiking enthusiasts only a few weeks before the trip. They had never seen each other in real life before that morning, which, according to investigators, created an atmosphere of some alienation from the start of the route. According to the plan recorded in the visitor log at the ranger station, the hikers were to hike 6 miles to Hamilton Hollow Falls, set up camp there, and return by the following evening. Justin moved confidently, but the hikers later recalled in sheriff's reports that the young man was often distracted by his phone, trying to catch a weak network signal in the dense Arkansas forests. Around 7:30 in the evening, the situation changed dramatically. The temperature plummeted to 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sky was covered with thick gray clouds. A powerful blizzard began, turning the forest into an impenetrable white wasteland, with no more than 10 feet of visibility in a matter of minutes. According to eyewitnesses recorded in the search team's report, the winds reached speeds of 30 miles per hour, knocking people down and forcing them to shout to hear each other. Not reaching the planned parking lot near the waterfall, the group decided to urgently set up camp in a small, sheltered clearing. Dinner was spent in tense silence around the fire, which barely smoldered under the onslaught of snow. And by 9 o'clock in the evening, all the participants went to their tents, trying to keep warm. On November 15, 2014, at 7 o'clock in the morning, the camp woke up to absolute, almost dead silence. The snowfall had subsided, leaving behind an 8-inch thick layer of fresh cover that hid any sign of human presence around the tents. One of the group members noticed that Justin's tent was standing with the entrance unzipped, flapping wildly in the cold wind. Looking inside, the campers found all of Justin's belongings: his warm sleeping bag, backpack, and even his boots. But the 18-year-old was nowhere to be found. He disappeared silently in the middle of the night, leaving no message or sign. The Newton County Sheriff's search operation began at approximately 11 a.m., when the surviving hikers were able to reach the area and call for help. More than 100 volunteers, K-9 units, and Arkansas National Guard helicopters were involved, but conditions were critical. Fresh snow not only covered the footprints, but also effectively sealed any scents, making the dogs' work useless. The boys' parents, Robert and Emma Patton, arrived at the scene on the evening of November 16th. They settled in the nearest motel near the park exit, demanding daily reports from the rangers and refusing to leave the mountains without their son. For 10 days, the intensive search continued. For 10 days, an intensive search was conducted, covering a 5-mile radius from the campsite. Rescuers combed every crevasse and every seasonal stream channel, but the Ozark forest held no answers. The only significant find was made only on the 4th day of the operation. Half a mile from the campsite, a steep slope was covered by on a steep slope with chaotic thorn bushes. One of the volunteers spotted a foreign object. It was a blue fleece mitten that was firmly clinging to the long, sharp thorns of an old hawthorn bush. The glove looked as if it had been torn from his hand by force or as a result of a fall, but no drops of blood or traces of dragging were found around the bush. This glove became the only physical evidence in the case, which was becoming more and more mysterious with each passing day. Investigators noted in their reports that the young man could not have walked that far barefoot on a frosty night. On November 28, 2014, the official search was officially suspended due to deteriorating weather conditions and a complete lack of new leads. Justin Patton's case was reclassified as missing under unexplained circumstances, and his name joined the long list of those whom the Ozark Mountains took forever, leaving his parents without even a shadow of hope. The forest became quiet again, hiding under the thickness of ice and snow, the secret of the night when the 18-year-old heir to a huge fortune disappeared into the white wasteland as if he had never been there. It was an unusually dry and frosty Tuesday night in the suburbs of Little Rock. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit and the sky was clear and starless, which only emphasized the silence of the upscale gated community. Justin's room remained untouched, and surveillance cameras recorded every minute bird flying over the high fence. Robert Patton, who over the years has become a man with prematurely graying hair and a heavy look, returned from the office at about 9 o'clock. His black SUV drove silently through the estate's automatic gates, shining its headlights on the perfectly trimmed boxwood bushes and the heated path leading to the garage. According to later interview reports, Robert sensed danger even before he turned off the engine. When he stepped out of the car, the cold air brought with it an odor that did not fit the atmosphere of the place at all. It was a persistent, almost nauseating odor of cheap self-sanitation, stale sweat, and a long, unwashed body. In a gated neighborhood where every inch of the territory was controlled by security guards and the air smelled exclusively of expensive wood and freshness, this smell seemed like a physical intrusion. Robert instinctively clutched his car keys in his pocket and walked around the hood. In the back of the garden, 50 feet from the garage, stood a dark oak bench. It was an iconic spot for their family. It was where Justin used to spend hours cleaning his climbing gear in preparation for his next hike. A man sat on this bench. He was sitting motionless, hunched over with his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the large panoramic windows of the living room, where a soft, warm light was burning behind the thin curtains. The man seemed to be part of the shadows cast by the pine trees, but his silhouette was all too real. Robert later recalled that his first impulse was to call security. He called out to the stranger, noting that this was private property, and ordered him to leave the area immediately. The man did not flinch at the harsh voice. He slowly, almost mechanically, raised his head and stood up as he took a few steps toward Robert, stepping into the light from the street lamp by the garage. Justin's father felt his heart skip a beat. He stood before him, wearing an old, faded army jacket that was 2 sizes too big for him. His face was covered with thick, unkempt stubble, and his skin looked weathered to the point of deep cracks that resembled tree bark. "I didn't think you were going to put up a new fence, Dad," the stranger said. His voice was raspy, like rusty metal scraping against stone. He added that he couldn't remember the digital code on the gate, so he had to wait for a car to enter. At that moment, Robert felt the reality around him begin to blur. The word tattoo sounded so surreal in this frosty silence that he was numb for a few seconds. He peered at the features of this emaciated man, trying to find in him his 18-year-old self who had gone into the Ozark Mountains 7 years ago. His eyes, the only detail that remained unchanged in color, now seemed like empty wells, devoid of any emotion. Robert was fixating on details that his businessman's brain was analyzing at the speed of a computer. The stranger was much broader in the shoulders than Justin, and on his neck, right above the collar of his dirty jacket, he could see a crimson scar that hadn't been there before. The door of the house opened, and Emma Patton stepped out onto the terrace, a woolen shawl draped over her shoulders. Seeing the man next to Robert, she froze on the top step. When the stranger addressed her, calling her mother, Emma made a sound that Robert later described as the strangled wheezing of a wounded animal. She did not wait for confirmation, did not ask questions about where he had been or how he had survived. She rushed to him, covering the distance of 20 feet in seconds, and clung to his dirty jacket as if he might disappear if she loosened her grip. Robert watched the scene from the sidelines, and instead of relief or joy, he was filled with cold, clammy fear. He saw the man standing perfectly straight as Emma hugged him. His hands hung motionless along his torso at first, and only after a few long seconds did he uncertainly, as if imitating a human reaction, put them on the woman's back. Justin's whole posture radiated not emotion, but a strange, menacing calmness. Robert dryly ordered him into the house, avoiding any physical contact with the newcomer. That evening, the doors of the mansion closed, cutting the Patton family off from the outside world. The police were not called, although procedure required immediate notification of the rangers and detectives who were working on the missing persons case. In the living room, under the light of crystal chandeliers, the man sat down in a deep armchair. He showed no signs of nostalgia. Instead of crying or starting a story, he slowly looked around the room. His eyes glided over the antique furniture, the silver collection, and the paintings on the walls. Emma thought her son was trying to recognize his home. But Robert saw something else in that look, the cold calculation of a man who assesses the value of property and the strength of locks. The house, which had been silent for 7 years, was now inhabited by a living mystery that smelled of cheap tobacco and hid answers under an old army jacket that could be more frightening than death itself. The first days after the sudden return of the man who called himself Justin were spent in an atmosphere that was later described in police reports as collective dissociation. The Patton home, which for years had resembled a quiet crypt, was suddenly filled with the sounds of life, which, however, seemed false and strained Emma Patton, according to the testimony of her maid, was completely immersed in a state bordering on religious ecstasy. She surrounded the newcomer with such hypercare she tried to fill a void of 7 years and 4 months in a matter of hours. She personally prepared his favorite dishes, blueberry pancakes and medium-rare steaks, that Justin adored at the age of 18. She bought up half the inventory of an expensive men's boutique in downtown Little Rock, throwing the stranger's old clothes, which smelled of damp and tobacco, into the trash on the first night. Emma sat for hours in the chair across from him, absorbing every word of his rambling stories. According to her later explanations, the man told a story about how he had allegedly fallen into a deep crevasse in the Ozark Mountains that fateful night, where he was found by members of some kind of closed forest community. He described a life in complete isolation from civilization, without electricity or communication, where strict rules reigned and from which he allegedly could not escape all these years due to constant surveillance and psychological pressure. His stories were devoid of specifics, no place names, or exact dates. He spoke in generalities, referring to the fact that he had been in a state of shock for a long time, and later, under the influence of some herbal decoctions. Emma didn't notice any inconsistencies. She simply refused to see the obvious gaps in his legend, perceiving any hiccups as a consequence of the trauma he had suffered. Instead, Robert Patton chose the tactic of a cold observer. He didn't join their family dinners, citing urgent business at the office, but in reality, he was watching every move of the man who took his son's place. In his notes, which later became part of the evidence base, it was noted that the physical form of the newcomer was completely inconsistent with the lifestyle of the former Justin. 18-year-old Justin was a slight young man with soft hands who had never done hard physical labor. The man who now sat at their table had calloused palms, typical of a construction worker or lumberjack, and his muscles had a definition that could not have come from simply surviving in the woods. It was the body's memory of years of regular, grueling exertion. The decisive moment occurred on the evening of February 24, 2022. During dinner, Robert, while pouring wine, casually mentioned Justin's old school friend, whom he called Billy Evans. He told a fictitious story about how he and this Billy had allegedly broken a window in the principal's office at the prom. The stranger, looking up from his plate for a moment, nodded confidently and confirmed with a subtle smile that he remembered the incident, adding that Billy had always been a troubled boy. The room fell into an icy silence for a moment, which only Robert noticed. The real Justin had never had a friend named Billy, and he was under his parents' supervision at the charity auction at the prom. When Robert later asked about the scar on his neck, the man calmly replied that it was a mark from falling on a sharp tree limb on the first night of the disappearance, but the wound looked like a clear surgical incision or a blade mark. However, Robert's real terror came later, around 22 hours and 30 minutes later. Passing by the door of his office, he noticed that it was a few inches ajar, even though he always locked it. There was absolute silence inside. Looking inside, Robert saw a picture that made him freeze. Justin was sitting in his massive Italian leather chair with his feet up on the oak desk where Robert made decisions worth millions of dollars. His posture was relaxed, almost royal. In his right hand, he held an old collectible 19th century dagger, a family heirloom that the real Justin had avoided since childhood, having an irrational fear of cold steel. The impostor slowly, almost with morbid pleasure, ran the pad of his thumb along the sharp blade, checking its sharpening. His face no longer wore the confused, tired mask of victimhood he had shown Emma. By the light of the table lamp, Robert saw the cold, smug smile of a man who had finally gotten a taste of someone else's power and luxury. When the man noticed Robert in the doorway, he did not flinch, did not try to hide his weapon or make excuses. He slowly laid the dagger on the polished tabletop, keeping his feet on the table, and looked his father straight in the eye. There was not a drop of filial love or remorse for the years of absence in that look. It was the look of a predator who had successfully entered someone else's territory and was now openly claiming his rights to it. That night, Robert realized for the first time that the man sleeping in his son's room was not just a stranger, but an invader who had brought a darkness from the Ozark Mountains that was far more dangerous than the one that had reigned there 7 years earlier. The evening of November 14, 2014, on the plateau near the Hemden Hollow Gorge became a point of no return, although at that moment none of those present could have foreseen the disaster. According to the testimonies of the hikers recorded in the National Park Service reports, the atmosphere around the campfire was tense and surreal at the same time. The blizzard that had started earlier had turned into a veritable wall of wet snow, limiting the camp space to just a few feet around the fire. The temperature plummeted to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind gusts were so strong that the flames were constantly pressed to the ground, releasing puffs of thick, acrid smoke. Justin Patton was in the center of attention, as witnesses recalled. Warmed up with expensive single malt whiskey from a metal flask, the 18-year-old felt like the master of the situation. He spoke loudly, shouting over the howling wind, and his speeches were filled with poorly concealed arrogance. Justin described in detail his father's business empire in Little Rock, bragged about his plans for a luxury vacation in the Alps, and repeatedly emphasized that his equipment, from a titanium burner to a $1,000 membrane jacket, was more expensive than most of the old pickup trucks in the room. For him, this trip was just a scenery for self-assertion, a game of adulthood, where all the other participants had the role of extras. According to other tourists recorded in the sheriff's reports, one of the group members, 18-year-old Larry Hansen, did not say a word during the entire evening. Larry was the exact opposite of Justin. He grew up in an abandoned trailer park on the outskirts of Fayetteville, in an environment where daily survival was not a sport, but a necessity. His mother suffered from severe alcoholism, and since the age of 16, he had been working on construction sites, doing the hardest menial jobs to pay for rent and food. His clothes were old and inappropriate for such conditions, and he bought his backpack at a second-hand sale. Listening to the cynical stories of a well-fed young man who had never held anything heavier than a tennis racket in his life, Larry felt a dark, uncontrollable rage boiling inside him. It wasn't just envy. It was a deep social resentment that had been building up for years and had now found its target. Around 22 o'clock in the evening, when the cold became unbearable, the group began to disperse to their tents. Eyewitnesses recalled that Justin, who was visibly intoxicated, refused to go to bed right away. He stated that he wanted to experience a real night in the mountains and staggered away from the camp toward a rocky outcropping that towered over a deep crevasse 30 feet from the campsite. He walked without a lantern, relying only on the faint light of the moon, which barely broke through the clouds. According to later reconstructions of the events based on confessions, Larry Hansen, who was supposedly already in his tent at the time, was actually watching Justin's every move closely through a narrow slit in the zipper. After waiting a few minutes for the other participants' breathing to become steady and calm, he slipped out silently. He was wearing only light boots, but he didn't feel cold. He was driven by an inner fire of hatred. The wind, howling between the pines at 40 miles per hour, completely drowned out the sound of footsteps in the fresh snow. Larry caught up with Justin at the very edge of the cliff. The young man stood with his back to the forest, arms outstretched and looking into the snowy abyss, as if challenging nature itself. When Larry came almost close, Justin turned around. Investigative reports state that Justin Patton's last words, according to the killer, were a dismissive remark. "What do you want, laborer? Lost in the dark without your mommy?" This was the final impetus. Larry did not engage in an argument. He took one quick and powerful step forward, shoving Justin in the chest with both hands. Due to his intoxication and the slippery surface of the stone, Justin lost his balance and fell on his back, but he did not immediately fall into the abyss, but caught on a ledge a few feet below. Larry saw the young man struggling to get up, his face distorted with horror and his hands frantically scratching at the ice. Then Larry grabbed a heavy piece of granite lying at the foot of the ledge. He struck it from the top down, precisely, quickly, and ruthlessly. The deafening sound of the stone hitting his skull bone momentarily drowned out even the whistling of the wind. Justin went limp and stopped resisting. Larry Henson acted with a coldness that was not characteristic of an 18-year-old teenager. He grabbed the body by the collar of his expensive jacket and pushed it with force into a deep crevasse, the bottom of which was lost in darkness. It was the perfect place. The blizzard was forecast to last at least another 6 hours, ensuring that any signs of struggle would be completely hidden under a layer of fresh snow. Larry returned to camp as quietly as he had left. He climbed into his sleeping bag, ignoring the trembling in his hands, and forced himself to wait for morning. When the sun began to break through the clouds, he was the first to run out of his tent and began to mimic panic. He played the role of a concerned comrade so convincingly that neither rangers nor experienced detectives had any suspicion for years that he was involved in the disappearance of the Golden Boy from Little Rock. The Ozark Mountains kept the secret safe, covering Larry Henson's sin with an icy shroud that seemed to never melt. March of 2022 brought to the Patton estate not springtime renewal, but a heavy, almost tangible atmosphere of mutual distrust. The reports of private security agencies that Robert consulted stated that the psychological climate in the house had become critical. Emma Patton continued to live in an illusory world where her son had returned, and she interpreted his every strange habit, refusing to use cutlery at breakfast or sleeping on the floor next to the bed, as a consequence of the horror he had experienced in the forest commune. She tried to dissolve his past in boundless love, but Robert Patton, with his experience in managing huge projects where every mistake cost millions, could not ignore the facts. His son was not just adapting to a new life, he was behaving like a person under constant external pressure that had nothing to do with their home. Robert decided to act methodically. Having no direct evidence for the police and fearing for the mental state of his wife, who might not be able to bear the repeated disappearance of the child, he chose the path of secret surveillance. On the night of March 7, 2022, when the house was silent, Robert went down to the garage. His father had installed a compact magnetic tracker with direct access to satellite coordinates on the silver SUV he had purchased for Justin just a week earlier. Over the next 10 days, the data on his work computer screen drew a strange and disturbing map of movement. Instead of the expected visits to shopping malls or walks in city parks, the guy regularly made long trips to the north of the state, to areas where residents of gated communities usually don't go even during the day. On March 14, 2022, at 14 hours 45 minutes, Robert received a notification. Justin's car had left Little Rock and was heading toward Fayetteville. After a pause of 10 minutes, Robert got into his old car, which he kept specially for such occasions, and followed. The road stretched for 190 miles. All the while, Robert kept a distance of at least half a mile, guided only by the flashing dot on his tablet screen. As Justin's SUV turned off the main highway into an industrial area on the outskirts of Fayetteville, the landscape outside the window changed dramatically. Manicured lawns and white picket fences gave way to dilapidated sheds, rusted metal frames, and shabby buildings that looked like they were only kept from total collapse by old paint and layers of dirt. Robert was parked around the corner of an old warehouse when he saw a silver SUV pull up in front of a one-story barracks on a rundown street where the asphalt had long since turned into deep potholes filled with muddy water. The air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and cheap fuel. Robert watched through his binoculars as Justin got out of the car. The guy didn't look like a young heir to $1 million fortune. He was wearing the same old army jacket over an expensive sweater. In his hands were 2 huge paper bags with the emblem of the elite supermarket where Emma had bought food for the holiday dinner the day before. Selected fruits, expensive canned food, and organic meat. The guy's behavior was extremely strange for a visitor. According to Robert's observations, he did not behave like a guest and showed no signs of joy. His movements were jerky, nervous, almost convulsive. He kept looking over his shoulder, checking every empty window of the surrounding houses, as if he expected an attack from the shadows. He approached the shabby porch where the steps were so rotten that they could collapse under each person. He didn't even try to knock on the door. He just threw the heavy packages on the dirty boards, as if it were not an offering but a payment of a heavy, humiliating debt that had to be made as quickly and inconspicuously as possible. In a moment, he was in the cab of the SUV. The engine roared to life and the car took off, kicking up clouds of dirt and dust as if Justin were trying to get away from this place at 70 miles an hour. Robert, hidden in the shadow of his car, looked at the red taillights that were quickly disappearing into the dusk. His heart was pounding in his chest, and hundreds of questions swarmed through his mind with no logical answers. What could possibly connect a young man who now had access to the best restaurants and privilege to this dilapidated barracks in a neighborhood where police statistics showed that there were more calls for gunfire than patrol cars? This visit was not like an act of charity or friendly assistance. In every gesture of the impostor, Robert saw a painful necessity, the fear of a man forced to buy someone's silence or loyalty. The father looked at the dark, almost black windows of the house, where no movement was visible behind the dirty glass. It seemed to him that these shabby walls hid some huge, ugly force that kept his son on a short leash, forcing him to leave the comfortable mansion and return to this hopeless grayness time and time again. This was an area where the laws of the Patton Cottage community did not apply, and for the first time, Robert truly felt that the mystery this man brought with him might not be related to his survival in the mountains, but to something far more terrible that had been going on here at the bottom of the Arkansas social pyramid. For all these long 7 years, he continued to sit in the car, staring at the bags of expensive food lying alone on the porch, waiting for someone to come out of the darkness of the house to pick up this unexpected tribute. The silence on the abandoned Fayetteville street was so deep that Robert could hear his own breathing, realizing that the next step in this game could be fatal for his family. On March 15, 2022, at 16 hours 45 minutes, Robert Patton recorded on his tablet screen that Justin's SUV had left the Fayetteville industrial zone. After waiting another 40 minutes or so to make sure the impostor wouldn't return for a forgotten item or because he was suddenly suspicious, Robert got out of his car. The smell of damp earth and rotting wood echoed in his temples as he walked across the cracked asphalt. The mansion in Little Rock, with its sterile cleanliness and layered security, now seemed like an illusion, and this grim reality of Fayetteville was the only truth he had ignored for too long. Robert walked up to the porch of house number 42. The boards under his weight made a pitiful creak that seemed to be heard all along the street. When he knocked on the door, covered in layers of peeling gray paint, he had to wait almost 2 minutes. Finally, the lock clicked, and a woman appeared on the doorstep. She looked to be in her mid-50s, but her deep wrinkles, emaciated face, and dull eyes betrayed a person who had been struggling with a severe addiction for years. She was wearing a stretched-out housecoat, and the air around her was filled with the lingering smell of cheap tobacco. The woman introduced herself as Marta. According to later interrogation reports, Robert acted in cold blood. He introduced himself as a representative of a charity that was supposedly conducting an audit of social assistance in the area. Robert asked if she had noticed any suspicious people or strange cars near her house. Alluding to the recent visit of an SUV, Marta took a drag on her thin cigarette and let out a dry, hoarse laugh. According to her, as recorded in the private investigator's report, she saw no reason to be concerned. "What suspicious people?" she said dismissively, waving her hand toward the empty porch. "That's my son, Larry. He's finally come to his senses. He said he found some suckers, some rich people from the South, and now we'll finally have a normal life." At that moment, Robert felt an icy cold spread through his body. Every word the woman said hit the nail on the head, destroying any hope he had that his suspicions were merely the result of paranoia. Larry. The name sounded like a sentence. Robert, trying to maintain his mask of a calm official, complained of sudden thirst and asked for a glass of water. Martha, who had already felt attached to the foundation representative because of his politeness, gestured for him to come in. The interior of the house was striking in its squalor and disorder. The walls were covered with yellow nicotine stains, and the furniture seemed to have been collected from various state landfills. While Martha fiddled with the faucet in the kitchen, which made painful noises, Robert stayed in the cramped living room. His eyes darted feverishly across the shelves, which were littered with old newspapers, empty medicine bottles, and other junk. It was there, between a dirty ceramic dog figurine and a stack of bills, that he spotted a dusty wooden frame. Robert walked closer, feeling his fingers tremble. He carefully wiped the dust from the glass with the sleeve of his coat. The photograph showed a group of 5 young men against the backdrop of the Ozark Mountains. It was a picture taken on the morning of November 14, 2014, a few hours before the fateful route began. In the center stood his son, Justin Patton. He was smiling, his expensive gear sparkling in the sun, and his eyes showed the same naive self-confidence that Robert so often criticized. But the worst thing was right next to him. Directly to Justin's right, with his hand on his shoulder in a gesture of fake friendship, stood a young man with a cold, focused face. It was a young Larry Henson. Even after 7 years and layers of weathered skin, Robert instantly recognized those eyes, empty and devoid of sparkle, which now looked at him every day at the dinner table in his own mansion. This was the same man who had gone into the woods 7 years ago as an unknown laborer from Fayetteville and returned as the heir to a fortune of millions, calling Robert his father. The photo left no room for doubt. She was a mute witness to the fact that Larry Henson didn't just know Justin. He was the last person to see him alive. Robert looked at his smiling son and the killer's hand on his shoulder, and every second of being in that house was torture for him. When Martha returned from the kitchen, holding a chipped glass of muddy water, Robert already knew that his life would never be the same again. He saw a woman who had lived in poverty for 7 years, waiting for her son to realize his horrible plan. And now she was getting her share of his son's blood in the form of bags from an expensive supermarket. Robert took only one sip, thanked the hostess, and went outside, where the thick spring twilight had already set in. His brain was no longer looking for excuses. Now it was looking for a way to destroy the invader who had taken up residence in his home, and to find out what really happened on that snowy night in 2014, deep in the Ozark Mountains. On March 16, 2022, at 22 hours and 30 minutes, Robert Patton did not return to his estate. Instead, his car pulled up outside the one-story brick building of the Jasper Police Department. Inside, the night was quiet, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of a coffee maker in the break room. Detective Miller, who 7 years ago was one of the first to arrive in search of Justin Patton, met Robert in a small office littered with old files and reports. According to the official protocol for accepting evidence, Robert Patton placed 2 key items on the table: a GPS tracker with a recorded route to Fayetteville, and the original photograph he had secretly taken from Martha Hanson's house. When Detective Miller illuminated the photo with a desk lamp and compared the face of the young man standing next to Justin in 2014 with the latest photos of the returned son, a heavy silence fell in the office. The photo was the missing element that turned the father's scattered suspicions into irrefutable evidence. That same night, the Jasper police made an emergency request for Larry Henson's fingerprints, which had been stored in the database since his arrest for disorderly conduct 8 years earlier. On March 17, 2022, at 6:15 in the morning, 3 patrol cars arrived at the gates of the Patton estate. The Arkansas State Police officers entered the house through the main entrance, where they were met by Robert. The arrest report noted that Larry Henson, who was in the kitchen at the time, showed no signs of surprise. When the steel handcuffs were locked around his wrists, he just calmly finished his coffee, looking out the window at the garden. However, the real drama unfolded in the living room. Emma Patton, awakened by the noise, ran to the first floor in her nightgown. According to the sheriff's officer, the woman was in a state of acute psychosis. She screamed, trying to push the police away from her son, and called what was happening a terrible mistake and a conspiracy. Robert had to forcefully hold his wife down, hugging her and whispering the truth that her mind refused to accept. The man she had been feeding and cuddling for the past month was the killer of their child. Emma fainted in her husband's arms just as Larry was being led across the threshold of the house into a patrol car. Larry Henson's interrogation began at 10 o'clock in the morning in the county jail. For the first 3 hours, he remained completely silent, ignoring the detective's questions and staring at a single point on the wall. The situation changed only when Detective Miller put 2 items in front of him: the same photo from the hike and a printout of the comparative analysis of the fingerprints taken from the steering wheel of Robert's car. The results were a 99 8/10% match. A video camera recording in the interrogation room captured the moment when Justin's mask finally fell off. Larry Henson slowly raised his head, and a dry, angry grin appeared on his face, more like a frown. According to the transcript of the interrogation, his first words were, "He was too weak for these mountains." Larry began to speak calmly, almost casually, describing how he had been studying news about the Patton family for years, knowing that Emma and Robert had never stopped searching. He admitted that the idea of replacing Justin did not come to him immediately, but after he saw an interview with Emma on television on the 5th anniversary of his disappearance, Larry realized that grief had made her vulnerable, and time had erased her son's fine features from her memory. He studied old photos of Justin on social media and prepared his legend of the forest commune. Larry Hansen detailed how he planned every move, including his sudden appearance in the garden on the same day and hour Justin usually returned from school. It was a gamble that staked a life of luxury that he, a trailer park kid, could only dream of. But the most frightening thing about his testimony was the ease with which he described the murder 7 years earlier. He spoke of Justin as a random obstacle on his way to a fair life, convincing detectives that the young man would not have survived that night anyway because of his arrogance and unpreparedness. The interrogation protocol ended at 17 hours and 40 minutes when Larry Hansen finally pleaded guilty to unlawful assumption of identity and premeditated murder, putting an end to years of lies that had almost become a new reality for the Patton family. On April 4, 2022, at 8:30 in the morning, the Newton County Sheriff's Specialized Search and Rescue Team began the final stage of the operation in the Hamadon Hollow Gorge area. Based on Larry Hansen's detailed testimony recorded in the interrogation reports, the search area was narrowed to a difficult-to-reach crevasse located 350 feet northeast of the group's former campsite. According to rescue reports, the terrain was so steep and overgrown with dense brush that the team had to use climbing equipment and chainsaws to cut their way down through the dead wood. At about 13 hours and 45 minutes, one of the volunteers, who was descending on a safety rope to a depth of 160 feet, noticed a fragment among the stones and roots of the old pine tree that did not belong to the natural landscape. It was a piece of blue membrane fabric darkened by moisture, which had almost fused with the soil over the course of 7 years. After lifting a layer of alluvial sheet and stones, forensic scientists discovered human remains that had been resting in a natural trap for all this time, hidden from the eyes of search parties since 2014. The forensic report stated that a clear blunt force trauma was found on the skull. 2 weeks later, the official Arkansas State Laboratory released the results of the deoxyribonucleic acid analysis. The probability that the remains belonged to Justin Patton was 99 9/10%. The trial, which began in June of 2022, attracted national attention but was surprisingly short. Larry Hansen stood trial on charges of premeditated first-degree murder, grand larceny, and identity theft. According to court transcripts, Larry behaved with frightening indifference. He sat at the defense table, completely still. He sat absolutely still at the defense table, not responding to the prosecution's evidence or to the presence of the victim's parents in the room. When the prosecutor showed off the silver-embellished dagger that Larry had shown off in Robert's office, the defendant smiled slightly, as if recalling the moment of his brief triumph. On June 20, 2022, at 14 o'clock, the judge announced the verdict. Larry Hansen was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in a maximum security prison without the possibility of any early release. Witnesses in the courtroom recalled that when the verdict was read out, Larry did not utter a single word of remorse. He did not even look in the direction of Emma Patton, who was crying quietly on her husband's shoulder. His gaze was directed into the void, at a single point on the wall behind the judge, as if he was already in the place where he would spend the rest of his days. The justice the family had been waiting for 7 years, 7 months, and 6 days was finally put down on paper, but it did not taste like victory. Today, the Patton estate was once again plunged into silence, but it was a different kind of silence, not the tense and expectant silence, but the heavy silence of closure. Emma Patton often sits on the same oak bench in the back of the garden where her son's ghost once appeared. She looks at the path that no one else will take, and at the gate, the code to which only 2 people now know. According to close family friends, Emma no longer keeps Justin's room untouched. She finally found the strength to pack up his belongings, leaving only one fleece mitten found in the Ozark Mountains years ago. Robert Patton approaches his wife as the sun begins to set behind the distant peaks of the mountain range, painting the sky the color of baked blood. He silently puts his hand on her shoulder, feeling the trembling that has accompanied them all these years finally disappear. They look at the mountains in the distance, at the white wasteland that once swallowed their only child. The mountains gave them back their truth, but took their lives. Now that the impostor's shadow has dissipated forever, they know where their son really rests. The last chord of this tragedy has sounded, leaving behind only the emptiness of the garden and the cold wind that brings the smell of pine needles and eternal peace from the mountains.